Lena Davis stepped into the lobby of a small branch of Davis Financial, a bank she had founded years ago. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The automatic doors whooshed open as she entered, her sneakers tapping lightly against the ground as she adjusted her casual cardigan over her shoulders. She wasn't here for anything grand. No urgent business, no meetings with high-profile clients, just a simple withdrawal from her personal account, the kind of transaction anyone might do on any given day. This was Davis Financial, the company Lena had built from the ground up. She had started the bank with the belief that fairness and accessibility were key to providing exceptional service. Over the years, she had steered it through countless challenges, always focused on making sure that customers were treated well. This branch was a key part of her vision. She had personally approved its location, overseen its opening, and even participated in the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Today, though, she wasn't wearing a tailored suit or high heels. She had no intention of drawing attention to her position. She was here simply as a customer. Dressed in a cardigan and sneakers, she approached the counter with a calm, neutral demeanor. She wasn't here to flaunt her title or make anyone treat her differently. She just wanted to make sure that her bank, the one she had built, was as fair as it had always claimed to be. The young teller behind the counter didn't immediately greet her, offering only a quick glance before turning her attention back to the computer screen. Lena cleared her throat, hoping to get her attention. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal," Lena said, her voice calm. The teller, Sophie Matthews, didn't look up but instead slid a clipboard across the counter. "Please fill this out," she said, without looking at Lena. The form was simple: name, account number, withdrawal amount. Lena filled it out quickly, writing down $5,000. It wasn't a large sum, but it was enough to warrant identification. As Lena slid the form back, she noticed a change in Sophie's demeanor. Her eyes flicked over the form, then to Lena's ID, and then back to the screen. For a moment, Sophie hesitated. There was an uncomfortable shift in the air, something subtle but noticeable. "Could you hold on a second?" Sophie asked, her voice now uncertain. She grabbed Lena's ID and disappeared behind a frosted glass door that led to the back office. Lena stood quietly, her fingers tapping lightly against the marble counter. She had expected to be treated with respect, but this was different. A few minutes later, Sophie returned, but she wasn't alone. Brad Sullivan, the branch manager, followed her out. "Good afternoon, Ms. Davis," Brad said with a stiff smile. He looked her over briefly before focusing on the form. "I understand you're making a withdrawal." Lena nodded. "Yes, $5,000 from my account." Brad hesitated. "May I take another look at your ID?" Lena felt a flicker of irritation. "I already gave it to Sophie," she said, her voice steady but firm. Brad didn't acknowledge the comment, instead holding the ID up to the light. It was as though he was inspecting it for any signs of falsification, even though Lena had been a customer at Davis Financial for years. After a pause, Brad asked, "What do you do for work, Ms. Davis?" Lena's jaw tightened at the question. "I run a bank," she replied, her voice now sharper. Brad nodded slowly, glancing at Sophie before asking, "Is this a personal account or a business one?" Lena's patience was running thin. "It's right there on the form," she said, her tone icy. Brad turned the ID over in his hands, still avoiding eye contact. Lena was starting to realize that this wasn't about a mistake or policy. It was about assumptions. Brad Sullivan's fingers lingered over Lena's ID, as if he was studying the fine print or waiting for something to stand out. The lobby had grown quieter, the usual hum of activity replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Lena's patience was wearing thin, but she kept her expression neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of showing her frustration. Sophie stood quietly by, her eyes darting between Brad and Lena. She didn't speak, her posture stiff. The tension was palpable, and Lena could feel it intensifying with every passing second. She had been in situations like this before, times when people questioned her authority or doubted her capabilities, but never like this. Not at her own bank. Brad looked back at her, his expression still carefully neutral. "Ms. Davis, I'll need to ask you a few more questions before we can proceed with the transaction," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something that didn't sit well with her. Lena forced herself to stay calm, but the question that followed was more than a little out of place. "And just to clarify, this is your first time banking with us?" Brad asked, his words almost calculated. Lena's stomach tightened at the question. This wasn't a new branch. She had opened it herself. She had signed off on every detail, personally approved the hiring of every employee, and even cut the ribbon at the grand opening. The question wasn't about the withdrawal, it was about something else. "I've banked here since the day this branch opened," Lena replied, her voice unwavering. Brad didn't immediately respond, his eyes flicking to Sophie before turning back to Lena. He seemed to be considering her words carefully, as though deciding how to proceed with this unnecessary line of questioning. It wasn't until he spoke again that Lena understood just how far this was going. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000, Brad said slowly, as though the sum itself needed to be justified. "Can you tell me what you do for work, Ms. Davis?" Lena was taken aback by the question. What was the point of this? Was her occupation not clear enough already? She had already told him she worked in finance. She was the CEO of Davis Financial. Did he really need more proof? "I run a bank," she repeated, her voice edged with frustration now. "The same bank you work for." Brad hesitated before asking another question, this time more pointed. "What kind of bank?" Lena's grip on the counter tightened. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. This wasn't just a routine check, it was an interrogation, and she could feel the subtle undercurrent of judgment in Brad's tone. "I own this bank, Brad," Lena said, her voice firm. "I founded Davis Financial." There was a moment of silence as Brad absorbed the weight of her words. The air felt thick, and Lena could sense a shift in the way he regarded her. He wasn't just asking questions anymore. He was testing her, looking for reasons to deny her request. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked down at the withdrawal slip and back at her, his expression still unreadable. "I see," he said slowly, though Lena knew he hadn't really heard her. "Is this a personal account or a business account?" Lena's patience was hanging by a thread. "It's a personal account," she replied, her voice barely controlled now. "The form is right there. You can see it. What's the problem, Brad?" Sophie shifted nervously behind him, but Brad didn't seem to care. He was looking at the form, his fingers tracing the details, as though there was something wrong. But Lena knew. He wasn't looking for mistakes. He was looking for a way to make her prove she belonged there. Lena stood still, watching him, waiting. She was done with this game. She wasn't going to be treated like a nobody, especially not in her own bank. Lena's patience was fraying. She had come to the branch expecting a simple transaction, expecting to be treated like any other customer. But this wasn't a simple request anymore. This had become a test, and she was beginning to see how far Brad was willing to push her. Brad glanced down at the form again, then back up at Lena. There was a pause, a tension hanging in the air, as if he was trying to figure out his next move. Lena stood her ground, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. She wasn't going to back down, not now. "So, you're withdrawing $5,000 from your personal account?" Brad repeated slowly, his eyes scanning her face, as if trying to determine if she would break. "Is that correct?" Lena nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, you've seen the form. Everything is in order." "What's the issue, Brad?" He didn't answer right away, instead turning the form over in his hands as if looking for a hidden flaw. But there was none. There was no reason for this delay, no reason for the extra scrutiny. Lena could feel her frustration building, but she didn't let it show. Finally, Brad looked up at her, his expression shifting slightly. "I'm going to need you to verify some additional information before we can proceed with this withdrawal." Lena blinked, confused. "Additional information? I've already provided everything. My ID, the form, my account number. What more do you need?" Brad seemed to hesitate for a moment, then he asked the question that pushed Lena to the edge. "Can you tell me the amount of your last deposit to this account?" Lena's jaw tightened at the question. That wasn't standard procedure. In fact, she knew it wasn't even a common request for large withdrawals. If she had been withdrawing a substantial sum, perhaps a secondary verification would have made sense. But not for $5,000. Not for a customer who had been with the bank since its opening. "I don't have that number memorized," Lena said, trying to stay calm. "But you have my account number. You can pull up the information like you would for anyone else." Brad didn't seem to hear her. He simply nodded, like he was processing her words, but his eyes remained calculating, as if searching for a way to make her prove she had access to her own money. Lena felt the weight of the moment, the uncomfortable silence pressing in around them. "We take security very seriously," Brad said after a beat, almost as though rehearsing his next line. "It's just a precaution." Lena's grip on the counter tightened. "A precaution?" she repeated, incredulous. "What exactly are you trying to say here, Brad?" Brad didn't answer. Instead, he reached over to the desk, picking up a small clipboard. "It's just policy. We need to verify that you're the account holder before we can process the withdrawal." Lena's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had been coming to this branch for years. She had opened it herself. There was no question about who she was or whether she had access to the account. So why was she being treated this way? Why was she being asked to prove something so obvious? "You're telling me that my ID, my account number, and my history with this bank aren't enough?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "You're making me prove that I'm entitled to my own money?" Brad didn't seem to understand the gravity of what he was doing. "It's just procedure," he repeated, his tone more detached than ever. Lena's eyes narrowed. She had been patient, but this was crossing a line. She was being treated like a criminal, and she wasn't going to stand for it. Not here, not in her own bank. "I don't believe this," she muttered under her breath. "This isn't about security. This is about something else." Brad shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't back down. He placed the clipboard down in front of her, pushing it across the counter with the same forced politeness. "You can fill out the form again if you like," he said, his voice too smooth. "It's just part of the process." Lena didn't move. She didn't touch the clipboard. She simply stood there, watching him, knowing that this wasn't going to end until someone took responsibility for what was happening. Lena's heart raced as she stood there, her patience long gone. The reality of what was happening hit her like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't about policy. It wasn't about security. This was about something deeper, something that had nothing to do with her account or the transaction at hand. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on Brad, her frustration simmering just below the surface. She wasn't going to fill out another form. She wasn't going to continue playing this game. Not here, not in her own bank. "Brad," she said, her voice now cold and deliberate. "This is ridiculous. I've been with this bank since day one. I helped open this branch, and now you're making me prove that I belong here?" Brad's expression didn't change, but Lena could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. For the first time, he looked a little uncomfortable. Maybe he had started to realize that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Maybe he was beginning to realize who he was dealing with. "You might want to check again," Lena said, her voice low but steady, "because I'm not just any customer." Brad didn't respond. He just stood there frozen, as Lena took a deep breath, preparing to drop the bombshell. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. Without breaking eye contact with Brad, she began recording. The silence in the lobby grew thick, the tension palpable. Lena could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, sensing something was happening, but unsure of exactly what. "You're refusing to allow me access to my own account," Lena said, her voice now clear and unwavering. "Despite providing government-issued identification, while other customers aren't being asked to provide anything extra." Brad's face paled slightly, but he didn't respond. He seemed caught off guard, unsure of how to handle the situation now that Lena was taking control of it. Lena shifted the camera slightly, now pointing it toward the security guard who had been standing silently by. "And you," she said, her tone even, "you were called over for what reason exactly?" The security guard hesitated, glancing at Brad before looking back at Lena. He didn't speak immediately, clearly unsure of how to respond. Lena didn't give him the chance to sidestep the question. "Answer me. Why are you here?" The guard shifted on his feet, uncomfortable under her gaze. "I'm just here to make sure everything goes smoothly," he said finally, his voice measured but uncertain. "Make sure everything goes smoothly?" Lena repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Or are you here to intimidate me, to make sure I understand my place?" Brad shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between Lena and the guard. clearly unsure of how to handle this situation. But Lena wasn't done. She lowered her voice slightly, making sure it carried through the room. "You've made a big mistake, Brad. A very big mistake." Brad's lips pressed into a tight line. "Ms. Davis, if you just calm down..." Lena cut him off, her voice now ice cold. "I'm calm, Brad, but you've clearly decided that I don't belong here. You've made your decision, and now I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." She took one last look around the room, locking eyes with the other customers who were now watching the exchange with rapt attention. She could see the realization dawn on them. This wasn't just about a bank transaction. This was about something far bigger. Brad, realizing he had no way out, made a final desperate move. He reached under the counter, pressing a button that sent a signal to security. Lena knew exactly what this meant. It was an escalation. He was calling for backup. A few moments later, a tall security guard in uniform stepped into the lobby, his expression unreadable. His hand hovered near his belt, clearly ready to act. But Lena wasn't fazed. She stood her ground, unwavering. "You're really doing this?" Lena asked Brad, her voice cool, though the tension in the room had become almost unbearable. Brad gave a stiff nod, though his expression faltered. "We just want to ensure a smooth experience for all our customers," he said, his words too polished, too rehearsed. Lena raised an eyebrow. "A smooth experience, huh? Well, Brad, I'll tell you this. I'm not leaving until you've processed my withdrawal. And if you think I'm going to stand here and let you treat me like this, you've got another thing coming." The silence in the lobby felt deafening. Lena stood tall, her eyes locked on Brad, who now seemed to be sweating slightly under the pressure. The security guard, still standing at the ready, shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed. Lena could sense the room hanging on her next move. Every customer, every employee was watching, either pretending not to or too afraid to look away. Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke again, her voice calm but sharp. "Brad, I'm going to say this one more time. You're refusing to process a withdrawal from my personal account, despite me providing all the necessary identification, and you're bringing in security as though I'm the one causing a scene. And for what? Because of the way I look? Because I'm not dressed in a suit today?" Brad's expression shifted, the mask of professionalism cracking ever so slightly. He opened his mouth to say something, but Lena cut him off. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," she said, her words clear, unwavering. "This is about bias, Brad. You've decided that I don't belong here, and now it's too late for you to fix it." She held her phone up again, pointing it at him. "This conversation is on record now, Brad. Everyone in this room is witnessing what's happening right now. If you don't process my withdrawal, I'm going to ensure that everyone who needs to know will." For a brief moment, Brad hesitated. He glanced at the security guard, then at the teller, Sophie, who had gone silent, her eyes averted. The weight of Lena's words hung heavily in the air. She wasn't just challenging his authority, she was calling out the unspoken prejudice that had been building the whole time. Lena took another step forward, her voice lowering but carrying an undeniable edge. "I helped build this bank, Brad. I am the reason this branch exists. I've personally approved your job here, and you're telling me that, despite all of that, you still can't process my withdrawal?" Brad's face drained of color as the truth of her words sank in. Lena could see the panic setting in. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. It was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. "Let me introduce myself properly, Brad," Lena said smoothly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. She stepped back and reached for her ID, which had been placed on the counter earlier. She flipped it over slowly, letting the name printed on it sink in. "You see this?" she said, tapping her ID against the counter. "This isn't just any customer's ID. This is the founder and CEO of Davis Financial." The realization hit Brad like a ton of bricks. The silence in the room was palpable. Lena didn't miss the way the security guard straightened up, the way Sophie's face drained of color, and the way the customers in the lobby shifted uneasily. Brad's lips parted, but no words came out. His hands shook slightly as he reached for Lena's ID, but he was no longer in control of the situation. Lena had reclaimed that power, and it was clear he wasn't prepared for what came next. I built this bank from the ground up, Lena continued, her voice steady and unyielding. I signed off on the budget that got you this job, Brad. And today I walked in as just another customer, but you treated me like I didn't belong. You humiliated me, lied to me, and now you have a choice. You can either process this transaction or you can deal with the consequences. Brad opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mouth worked silently as he desperately tried to recover his composure, but it was too late. You had your chance, Lena said, her voice calm but firm. And now you're going to explain this to corporate. She turned to the security guard. As for you, she said, her voice colder than before, if a customer isn't disruptive, the first step shouldn't be intimidation. You need to be more careful about whose instructions you follow. The security guard gave a small, uncomfortable nod. He had already realized his mistake, and there was no coming back from it. Lena turned to Sophie, who had been silent throughout most of the exchange. And you, she said, her voice soft but commanding. You saw my ID, you saw my account number, and yet you still decided that I wasn't worth listening to. Sophie's face flushed and she stammered, I was just following protocol, ma'am. Lena stepped closer to the counter, her tone sharp now. Protocol that only seems to apply to people like me? Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked down at her register, her hands shaking. Lena took a moment to breathe, letting her words sink in. The tension in the air was thick, but she was done. She had made her point. She turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the polished tile. The silence in the bank was deafening, and as Lena stepped through the door, she knew things would never be the same. The fallout from that day was swift. The next morning, Lena had already scheduled an emergency meeting with her leadership team. Every branch manager was called in for an urgent review of customer service policies, and Todd, Brad in this case, was fired. Mandatory bias training was implemented across all branches, and a new accountability system was introduced. Davis Financial saw immediate change. Employees became more aware of their actions, customers began noticing the difference, and Lena made sure that this wasn't just a one-time change. It was permanent. Lena never forgot that day. It was a reminder that change doesn't come from words or policies on paper. It happens when someone takes a stand, refuses to accept what's wrong, and demands that things be made right. And Lena Davis was just the person to do it.